I've known Richard for a lot of years now, and when there's anything having to do with housing whatsoever, I go to Richard. The man is a sheer genius. He knows the literature inside and out. It's fantastic. But with that in mind, his economic forecasts are maybe not quite as up, shall we say, up to speed. I don't agree with the pessimism on the health of the U.S. economy. We know the economy isn't slowing. We're going to get a 2% growth in the third quarter. The consumer is ultra healthy. Savings rates are yet again above 8%. The last time they were there was back in the early 1990s. Debt to income ratios are low. The financial obligations ratio is at a record low level. You're not going to have a recession with the consumer sector that healthy. And it's not going to be driven by trade with China. In fact, what's interesting about the trade war with China, what I have learned is how amazingly resilient we are to any kind of interference in trade with China, because they're far more exposed to this issue than we are. And as a result of that, the tariffs, the yuan has dropped by 15%. They've already picked up 2/3 of the tab. It's been more or less irrelevant on this side of the Pacific, which I think is an interesting circumstance. So from my perspective, you have lowering interest rates. Next year is actually going to be a good year for housing. Now, a good year for housing is bad news in Southern California if you're worried about housing. Because everything Richard said about the lack of housing and the pressures it's putting on our economy here are absolutely true. So in a very real sense, my primary issue right now is that next year we're going to see these housing markets heat up quite a bit. And that, of course, is going to lead, probably in my estimation, even more bad policy on the part of California. Because the solutions to what we have here going on here are pretty obvious, but no one in Sacramento seems to want to acknowledge that. For all the hubbub, what did we get this year? Rent control. You talk about going in the wrong direction. So in a sense, I am both confident but also worried about the next year. But again, it's not because of recessions. That's not in the cards for 2020.
From my perspective, first of all, the short man between two tall men, that's pretty interesting. They put me in the middle. From our perspective as a practitioner, as an industry participant, we're looking at the market slightly differently. I think that one of the things that I agree with you with respect to next year, given this is an election year, and given that I think there has been some element of politics involved and political pressure on Fed decisions, I think that we're going to see the continuation of a pretty relaxed policy from the Fed's perspective. However, with respect to housing, I do agree with Richard's viewpoint here. This is not a challenging housing environment, but not all markets are created equal. Not all micro markets are created equal. So you got to dive very, very deeply into each market segment and analyze it. For example, downtown Los Angeles. Downtown LA is substantially oversupplied and with a specific product type, a luxury product type that maybe is absorbing, but none of those business plans are probably meeting their expectations. To the flip side of it, go to the San Gabriel Valley and develop a new project, and guess what? You have rent growth, you have great demand at lower price points, and then you're looking at our regional transportation. So as we improve the access to the employment centers, we continuously do different things. So we can't batch the entire, even the LA region cannot be put into one projection. One of the things that, in my opinion, in the forecast and the report that really caught my eye and was really disturbing is the fact that we're looking at the skill set of our region, and if you exclude Orange County and you exclude San Diego out of it, we are below average to the nation. And that means substantial headwinds towards our competitiveness over the long haul. So something has to be done with that. With respect to rent control, you really have to balance, the social element with the competitive element. I actually think that the Senate bill, from a development perspective, which is where we focus, is actually pretty non-eventful on that front, given the fact that we got a 5% increase plus inflation, plus a 15-year duration with respect to when this kicks in. So from a developer's perspective, I think that it's a very, very good compromise. The risk really in that particular policy is the C stock that people have raised a ton of money in the capital markets to create value-add opportunities and improve C properties to B, in which that particular pricing matrix can be very challenging. So if you look at it, there's different elements. There's a lot of shades of gray, and I'm going to stop talking.
Before we move to Malcolm, you just said something that I want to follow up on a little bit, which is you talked about the San Gabriel Valley and transportation access. Do you have confidence that we have the ability to actually connect people from the vast reaches of the Southern California to each other? I mean, metro ridership, we've spent a lot of money on metro, and ridership is down something like 25% from peak.
Right. Richard, I think that one of the things that we have done a poor job as a region is changing the culture. LA and Southern California is a car culture, and I think that from the perspective of creating that ridership, we put the infrastructure in, and then we have not done a good job in actually creating the incentive program to convert car ridership into public ridership. There's more futuristic view, right? As autonomous cars and autonomous transportation becomes more advanced, we will have another opportunity to take care of that regionally. But again, I think it's about changing the culture. It's not about the investment.
Can I?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Actually interesting, you think about the lack of housing, and the lack of housing is driven in large part by really NIMBY opposition to densification. It's not culture. Public transport works in highly dense environments. The problem here is that because we fight back against density, in a very real sense, we're fighting back against the ability for our public transportation systems to work efficiently. Right. There's a reason people get in their cars. It's a very limited set of things you can actually do on public transportation now in Southern California.
Right. However,
well, let me just interject there quickly, because if you think about some of the most dense cities in the country where public transportation is a very viable option, namely New York and San Francisco, I don't think that affects in any way the tremendous imbalance between supply and demand. The real challenge, if we're talking about those two cities, is that rich people don't like to live next door to poor people. And in New York, where I spend probably half my time at this point for the firm, I noticed folks hopping off of the train, going to our offices in Midtown, from places far and wide throughout the city. But if you ask them, where does your doorman live? It's probably not in the exact same building or the same zip code, despite the fact that they both take the train to work. So I don't know that necessarily affects whether or not you're going to shrink the ask bid spread between affordable housing in large cities. So that is one challenge for LA specifically, but we've seen in other areas of the country that doesn't necessarily affect whether or not housing is affordable for the masses. With that being said, so I'm at JP Morgan, and I will say this to Richard's first question, responding to an invitation to refute the claims of any economist is an unwinnable argument, as you just heard from Chris and Richard. So I'm not even going to attempt that. I will note at JP Morgan, we can afford to take a macro view. And that means our perspective on housing is really colored by the fact that we're a large commercial bank at our core, and we need to look at whether or not our growth outstrips the growth of all of the places where we want to do business. So you've seen in the very recent past companies like Facebook, Kaiser, Centara, an East Coast-based healthcare system making large investments in affordable housing, largely because they recognize that they are in places where there is, again, a significant imbalance between the supply and the demand for affordable housing. And so they have to, as private companies, private investors, wade into the affordable housing fray, and we've done the exact same. So our platform is focused on financial returns, but more broadly, it's focused on community impact. And so we can actually trade, in a lot of cases, market returns on our investments in affordable housing for the returns that we see in the community. And that is really a look that not all investors can afford to do. But I do think if you're looking for some solutions to the affordable housing crisis, you've got to find ways to say, if none of my employees can afford to live within a 90-minute drive of where our office is that good for my business? And the answer is no. We saw that in the stats on migration out of LA. So we're looking at investments with responsible fund managers in key urban markets across the country where we really take Class C and in some cases B properties and try to preserve some level of affordability. So that means partnering with folks who are committed to affordability for people at 60 to 80% of area median income, and saying the amenities are not going to be a dog washing park, a new volleyball court, an Equinox level gym. The amenities will be us partnering with some local nonprofit that's going to put after school services at the apartment project for the children of the single parents who work from 9 to 6 and they need a place for the kids to do homework. So that's an amenity that will keep them at the property. That's an amenity that reduces turnover. It's an amenity that ultimately helps the bottom line at the property, but you have to have a commitment to maintaining affordability. And again, because we can afford to take a macro view, it works for our bank. I don't know that every investor can afford to make that determination, but I think every investor should be thinking about it. Especially when we hear some of the alarming stats about migration out of our city.
Yeah, and so I remember, one way to think about this, I'm going to put people on the spot, is if your choice for a city to invest in is Phoenix, Vegas, San Diego, LA, I'm going to say LA/Orange County, Bay Area, Portland, Seattle, where do you go right now?
So I'll take that. I'd say for us, just about all of those places, maybe not as much Las Vegas. And in Phoenix, though, we're actually seeing opportunities to invest alongside developers because the cost of land is not quite as high as it is in some of the other cities you named.
Malcolm's good at understanding.
Yeah. I'd say just about all of them have challenges with affordability, but more preservation of affordable housing. So preservation of Class C and B properties in the Bay, Southern California, Portland, Seattle, some development in Phoenix, though.
I'm going to pull out my finance class and tell you that you can't be for or against any of those. They're all just different in terms of the risk-reward ratio. I mean, clearly, if you can get something built in a good location in LA or San Francisco, you're going to make a mint. The problem is spending all the time and money trying to get it built, and it may blow up in your face. So in a very real sense, I think that the potential returns in these West Coast markets are enormous, but it's a dogfight, and who needs that stress? Some people take it on. So it's really what your taste is.
So for us, 50% of our business, both on the multifamily and on the for sale housing, is in those markets from San Diego to Seattle. However, we're in the development business, right? We're equity providers in that space. And for us, as we look at risk reward and being able to mitigate a big chunk of the entitlement risk, which is really where you get bogged down in the process. For us, as we look at those markets, probably the coastal markets represent the better opportunity. With respect to Phoenix, Phoenix has a lot of construction. It's dominated by publicly traded builders, at least on our side of the equation. On the for sale side, the margins are very low, and we're in this business for profit, so we're very, very focused on that. With respect to markets like Seattle and Portland, we're very, very active in those markets. We are focusing our business there in infill markets, staying away from the suburbs, where we think that the better opportunities exist. However, if I balance the equation, and we're very, very, very opportunistically active in Vegas. On the multifamily side, since we're in the build it, stabilize it, and sell it business, we have to be liquid. Phoenix is not a great market for us to be in. The cost of producing a unit there is about the same as the cost of selling it when it's finished to the open market. That doesn't do the trick for us. Vegas, the same way. So on our multifamily side, it's even more important to be focused on the coastal markets. So for Resmark's, from Resmark's perspective, our housing business is a little bit more flexible, and that drives affordability. Our multifamily market is really focused on the coastal markets.
So, I mean, what Chris's answer was clearly correct, except there sometimes are little arbitrage opportunities out there, and I was asking if you could find them. The other reason I asked the question is one of the members of the Lusk board put up a chart a couple of weeks ago where he showed states by migration, and he said go long on states within migration and go shorts on states without migration, and California's a state without migration, and yet maybe it's still a good long play, and so that's not necessarily correct inference to draw. Whereas Nevada, for example, is clearly loads of
people
migration.
are moving in. I think your board member's intuition was completely right, with the exception of California. I mean, California stands out in that mix because it is the strong economy of all the states that are losing people. California is a very strong. We're still in the top 10 for job growth over the last 5 years. We're still growing jobs faster than the national average, even in the midst of this chaos. There is higher wage growth in California than any other state in the country right now. So there's plenty of good things happening here, with the exception of building enough housing.
And so is that, in the end, is that going to interrupt this prosperity? Is there going to be a point where people just can't move jobs here anymore or can't expand here anymore because there's no place for people to live?
It's getting to that point. You look at Orange County in LA, and you look at the tremendous slowdown in job growth in these counties, and you start to recognize that, yeah, it is starting to bite. But remember, in the end, your economy still grows. But what happens is it grows to the inclusion of certain parts of the economy and the exclusion of others. So what you end up with is what I've coined in the past as Country Club California. It'll be fine. We're going to have a good standard of living, but that's not inclusive. There's a whole bunch of people who are not going to be able to, shall we say, pay that entry fee.
And I would add, that really gets close to the tipping point for true social problems that unfortunately cannot be corrected through policy. If at the bottom of the pyramid you've got safe, clean, affordable housing for not just ourselves, but our employees, our children, and if that doesn't work properly, who ultimately will you hire? Who will you send your kids to school to go learn with? That becomes a problem that none of us can solve. And I think we've got to take a longer term view on what returns should look like. It really can't just be about how do I buy, stabilize, and flip a property. because that's not good for the long term. It unfortunately just widens the gap between the haves and the have-nots. There's a reason country clubs have really big gates and strong alarm systems.
Well, I think, okay, go
I
ahead,
do have a
Ziv.
question for
Yeah, yeah,
you.
yeah.
So look at California, and I know capitalism is a relatively new phenomenon in the world. Is there any benchmarking that can be done to cities or regions in Europe, right? And can draw any level of comparison to kind of show us where we're headed, maybe?
And so, that's a great question. 20 years ago, I thought London was not sustainable because London 20 years ago is sort of where we are now, if you look at housing affordability. And if it hadn't been for the fact that London shot itself in the foot with Brexit, it would still, London is actually weak in the last couple of years, but that had nothing to do with the housing market. That just had to do with, let's stop having the most talented people from Europe migrate to our city, which is one of the things that makes London London. It's where everybody wants to be. And so I wanted to say, this is really going to matter. This is really going to hurt the economy. And then I look at London, where the average one-way commute, by the way, is 75 minutes. At least if people don't drive, they're taking a train, but it's 75 minutes one way. It's hard for me to say, if housing is expensive and it's unfair and all that, your economy is going to collapse, because London has done just great for 20 years. The current phenomenon going on right now, though, is if you read about Hong Kong, and I am hardly an expert on Hong Kong, but there is been a lot of commentary on, the sort of trigger for the protests that are happening in Hong Kong was China's desire to be able to extradite people from Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China. When you really dig into it, a lot of it relates to housing. And Hong Kong did a great job for many, many, many years housing people. So half the people in Hong Kong were in some sort of subsidized housing. But at the end, the government just couldn't afford that anymore, and so the cost of housing has gone up. And again, I don't want to promise you that this is true. This is based on me reading stuff by people who know a lot more about Hong Kong than I do, but there have been people who've written that this anger has bubbled up because suddenly people can't afford to live there anymore. And again, when you have less money at the end of the month than you had a year ago, that upsets people pretty much everywhere. And so consequently, to Malcolm's point about political stability, there may be an example of how it has quite directly led to political instability. Now, that said, Hong Kong is unique. There is this problematic relationship with China, so I don't want to push that too hard. But to try to answer your questions, if that seems to be, and Hong Kong is, again, it's an amazing city, and it's like California. It is talented people want to go to these places. Is you tell anecdotes when they illustrate data, but one of my kids lived in London for a while. I mean, she lived a horrible life in London. She didn't care. She rented a room. I don't mean like a room to herself. I mean a bedroom for £1,000 a month. This is like 4 or 5 years ago. It's like, why do you want to do that? Well, because I want to live in London. And so the ability of these cities to attract talent seemingly no matter what, San Francisco is like this, New York is like this, LA is like this, is very real. But you do wonder if there is a breaking point to all of this. But I wasn't supposed to answer questions. I'm supposed to ask them, so.
Turn it a little bit.
Yeah,
It's okay.
yeah. Malcolm, you have a comment?
No comment on that. I got to say I'm not necessarily an expert on housing in Europe, but I will say this is the room that actually does have a lot of influence on what happens, not just here in Southern California, but in our industry. And we should all be challenging ourselves to think about innovative ways, whether it's through policy or through some of our own investments, to figure out some solution to the affordable housing crisis. It really is a matter of consequence for all of us, But because we are developers, because we are capital allocators, because we are legislators, we can in some ways affect this issue right at the core. I spent a lot of time, and this is how Zeev and I got to know each other. I spent a lot of time in J.P. Morgan's debt capital group, financing, multifamily projects for large REITs like Resmark. And to a man, all of those clients were really good people, charitable in spirit, built high quality product that they could be proud of and their residents could be proud to live in. So absolutely nothing wrong with that part of the business. In fact, I consider Zeev to be a really dear friend, and his partners are still close with me. But at some point in my tenure at JP Morgan, I had to make a decision about what side of the ledger I wanted to be on. And ultimately, I was encouraged because it kind of came at the same time that our chairman and CEO had continued to beat the drum around what kind of impact should private industry be making to some of these challenges. And so we took an idea to a business plan to a real billion-dollar business that invests in affordable housing in markets across the country. And I'm encouraged because a few of our partners don't just do affordable housing. Some of the better operators in this space have really successful market rate businesses that we continue to bank at JP Morgan, but they also kind of see the opportunity to be good operators in the affordable housing space, and JP Morgan wants to partner with those folks. And I would just encourage you all to think about where you can, from your seat, affect this very issue. For most of the folks in this room, a recession will not be something we can't recover from. And I'm talking specifically about the folks in this room. But for the folks on the outside of this room, the next recession could be devastating. So you have to think, how successful can we be if the next recession is going to devastate everyone who's outside of this ballroom? And if you knew that you had a chance to be on the right side of history and potentially stem that devastation, but you didn't do it, how would you feel about your career legacy 2 decades from now? So not to get all preachy, and the debates were a couple of nights ago, so I missed my chance to throw my hat in the ring for that. But I do think this is a very powerful space because, again, housing is the base of the pyramid. There's a myriad of issues, financial, social, trade, you name it. But if you don't have safe, clean, affordable housing, you can't save to send your kids to college. They then can't go get gainful employment. You can't move a rung up the ladder. And ultimately, you throw yourself into the it just doesn't matter category, and that's very dangerous. That's very dangerous. So I would just challenge all of us to think about where from your seat you can actually stem this tide. And I bet if you put your mind to it, you'd find that you do have a lot of power. You do have a lot of power in that space.
Right, and from your perspective, Malcolm, you're talking about a societal issue, a lot more than just basic an economic issue, right? And the economic elements coming through the line here, through the process. The question previously, in previous cycles and previous situations, the creation of driving for dollars, right, has been a very significant way in which we dealt with housing attainability. I don't want to talk about affordability. To me, that's a much more specific issue. But when you basically do that, there are other societal, taxes that we pay, right? We pay the tax of parents not seeing their kids. We're paying the tax of cars and the environment and things of that nature. So as the bank is, I salute the bank for taking on a position that is looking at basically doing well and doing good at the same time. But what is kind of philosophically, from a housing perspective, is the strategy staying in the core neighborhoods and renovating them, or basically is it open to additional products, i.e. rental housing in Beaumont, right? and things of that nature, and utilize the 75-minute drive, right, into the work core.
No, so you ask a really good question. So specifically, it is very difficult, even if we've got some reduced hurdle around financial returns, to find product that is in city centers in major urban markets. So in LA, that means we're investing with partners who own properties in places like Santa Ana or Long Beach. So I'd consider those to be LA adjacent, Orange County adjacent, but not necessarily downtown LA, certainly not West Hollywood. In Washington, D.C., we're investing not in DuPont Circle, but in projects just outside the border of the D.C. line.
Are
in
they
Silver
near metro
Spring.
stations?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, near metro stations. In New York City, it's projects in Queens, Newark, New Jersey, which is not necessarily New York City adjacent, but it is increasingly difficult to preserve affordable housing if you're focused solely on city centers. So you instead have to think about access to transportation, making sure that those projects are not in food deserts. Those are still livable communities. Those are still communities that can be desirable, but it is definitely a real challenge to find projects in city centers where the Relateds and the Fairfields of the world exist.
Right. From our perspective, and maybe the rosier side, we've been talking about societal issues. The rosier side, we focus on basically market rate housing in the development world. So we, while we're not building, 40-story towers, we build, mid-rises and garden style in urbanized suburban markets and with urban core adjacent markets. If we do all of that, I think we still see substantial demand. And actually, the lack of housing has been an enhancer of profitability to us.
Sure, of course.
And that's, a rosier side for us, but it also shows that there is substantial demand at that level because of the incomes that Chris was talking about. So there's a balance to the equation. I think from Malcolm's perspective, his view is respected and admired. At the same time, you can coexist in a for-profit environment, in a affordable housing environment, either on a do good and do well side of the equation or just for profit. I see a lot of people that are moving towards the subdivision rental business in the outskirts. I think that's a viable business that maybe not closer in California, but in other markets. So there's definite, we have such a diversified economic base, and that's very helpful.
I want to, I'm appreciative of the societal pressures, the families who are stressed, how we have to support those folks. But Richard, you said it, I remember in our conversation not too long ago, where you said it's not about changing supply, it's changing the elasticity of supply. That's important here.
Yeah.
The biggest problem we face is that, sure, we're putting efforts into place to try and help those who are constrained by housing costs, a lack of housing as the case may be, but at the same time, we're not getting rid of any of the restraints on building regular housing.
Yeah, and
we
excuse
just
me,
don't
I
have
just
the
want to
supply. It's getting worse.
I want to remind the audience, building
Yeah.
permits are down 30% from a year ago.
So you have a situation where, yes, we put these money in. We have J.P. Morgan, we have government programs, and you're nudging the supply curve over little bit. But at the same time, in a strong economy, if you want to live here, that demand curve is going way out. We got to get that supply curve to do this. We got to figure out how to liberalize. And the private sector, that is probably as important as any regulation or say affordable housing tax credits and all these other programs that try to deal with that part of the population. If you do one and not the other, you're never going to win. And that's the biggest problem we face right now.
And I'm looking forward to hearing from our keynoter about exactly that issue in a bit.
Yeah.
So let me move the conversation a little bit because we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to open the audience, open the floor to questions from the audience. But as if you talked briefly about for sale housing, and so this has become a chestnut to ask people, but it's worth thinking about. One of the things that leads to demand pressures on the rental side of the market is people not buying houses. the homeownership rate has dropped about 7 percentage points from peak to trough. It's now about where it was 50 years ago. It went up a little bit. It's come back down a little bit. I think it's actually been just kind of noise the last couple of years in the data. Do you think we have ceased to be a nation of homeowners? Is this a permanent thing? Or ultimately will, and I always hate to use the word millennials anymore because it's become such a cliche, say, yeah, I want to buy a house, and that will provide a little bit of relief to the rental side of the market?
That's a tough prediction to make. However, you're absolutely right with respect to the home ownership. And we look at the mix. If you look at the mix on a go-forward basis, right, you have millennials that are aging and appear to be making a purchase decision, not necessarily upon marriage, but upon starting to raise kids. That's kind of where we see that shift happening from an operational perspective. The other side of it is the baby boomers. So we're basically talking about two ages, and then there's the Gen Xers, which have no relevance, unfortunately.
Thank you, appreciate that. From my generation
We have
to
nothing.
yours, you know.
We have nothing. So, but anyways, on that front, you do see some movement, but that movement is constrained by valuation, right? Because the valuation of the home that they're getting out of and what are they buying. It's been our experience that some of them are actually moving up, not moving down from that perspective, and that has helped fuel the luxury side of the business. So as I look at that...
And a student of mine is saying, so boomers are staying in their houses longer than past generations did. They're just not moving out.
They are. And when they are moving, from our experience, they're not moving substantially down. They're actually moving to the next, to the next house, which is pretty amazing in a sense. And that has basically helped the luxury part of the market to continue to be this strong. However, barring them not being able to get out of their debt, and I'm talking about millennials, I think that over time, this is a economic temporary issue. Home ownership has, beyond an investment element, has, again, societal value. And I think that that's going to get equalized over time. I don't think that home ownership is just a phenomenon that's going to continue to dwindle down. The demographic issue that I see is, the baby bust of the Great Recession. About 2030 is kind of, that's ways out, but that to me, the mix of both income and housing in 2030, that's a riddle that I haven't solved yet.
The question is are affordable housing policies successful?
Again, that goes back to my previous comment about making some kind of difference at the margins. If you think about just any household's expenses, and it doesn't matter kind of where you are income-wise, in most cases, housing represents the largest portion of your actual monthly expenses. So you can't subsidize the entire ecosystem, but subsidizing housing is a start. And yeah, it might be pretty expensive to go shop at that Trader Joe's in the neighborhood where 10% of the building's units are affordable, but you have some options. You have some options because you aren't spending 60% of your take-home pay on housing.
And by the way, the Trader Joe's is much cheaper than the bodega. Seriously.
That's amazing. Yeah.
I got a question. Putting that all on one side. Has there ever been a housing supply crisis that's been fixed by affordable housing policies? In the history of the urban planet? Have we ever truly fixed housing with government policy?
Yes.
Where?
Not in the U.S.
Where?
Singapore.
Singapore, okay. So
The average person in Singapore spends 22% of their income on housing. And what happens, the government owns all the land, everything's on a ground lease. You can retrade your unit to people who are also eligible. and the eligibility is like 130K a year or less, something like that. But
if you're an expat trying to live in Singapore, what does
it's
the apartment cost
impossible.
you?
It's impossible.
Yeah.
But for 80% of the people living there, they have very nice, and if you're a Singaporean, you're fine.
Just don't chew gum.
Just don't chew. Actually, you're allowed to do that, but you need a prescription.
Ah, there you go.
Yeah, but we do not want to get to a fully controlled government.
No, I'm not saying we should be Singapore, but you asked the question. Actually, if you go, they are very impressive in how they go about housing people there. I've never seen anything like it. But yeah, you give up some stuff in exchange for that I personally would prefer not to give up. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So you don't own the ground underneath your unit, right? And so there's no, and you're only allowed to own one unit. If you buy a unit in the private market, you got to get out of your unit that's on the ground lease. So yeah, you own the sticks, but not the ground underneath it. That's exactly how it works. And the only reason they can do it is because the government, they don't own all, they own 90% of the land on the island, something like that. And it's on, I think, 49-year ground leases. And then what the government can do is tear down your building if they decide they want to do it at year 49 and put something else up. And they do that, but then they make sure they relocate people. I don't think it's very practical. But since Chris asked, has a government housing policy ever worked? Yes, I think that one
sounds like the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting. If you go back in this country to, it's either 1970 or 1980 census, and forgive me for not remembering which one. There was a house in every city. There was a house that people could afford, which is to say, given your income level and given the distribution of rents and house prices, there was a place that you could afford in 1970. If you look at apartment rents after World War II, between World War II and about 1987, they moved in step with inflation. And then their separation started happening at those points. And I think it comes back to Chris's point about elasticity. It suddenly became, California, when the San Fernando Valley wasn't filled out yet, you could just build to your heart's content. But then that stopped. So other stuff too. Any other questions from, yes, sir? Comments on a split roll?
It makes the housing supply crisis worse.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Because what you're going to end up doing is biasing cities even more against housing.
Right.
Remember, in the end, the problem with housing in California is that cities don't want it. And they don't want it because they get 80% of the revenues from business. So every time you give a hunk of land to residents, you're basically putting another nail in your fiscal coffin. You really want to fix housing in California, incentivize cities, local governments to want housing. The split roll takes the problem and makes it worse.
Right.
Or let's put it this way, I want a split roll, let's get rid of Prop 13 for housing.
Right. And Exhibit A for that is, you have a very progressive government right now in Sacramento that wants housing. Everybody talks the talk, and then when it comes to the municipal level, where decisions are made about the project, it gets stopped.
Yeah, just look at the last SCAG meeting.
That's Exhibit
what
A.
happened there, boy.
Yeah, that's all correct. It is, when zoning was invented, the idea was that houses were amenities and warehouses were nuisances. And it's now the way government treats things is warehouses are amenities and houses are nuisances.
So in San Francisco, we see kind of a tale of two submarkets. We're looking at an investment in the Tenderloin district where a handful of that land is still owned essentially by public entities. And it's still possible to build affordable housing for folks at anywhere from 40 to 70% of AMI. The Mission District, not so much. A lot of that property is owned by private owners and very hard to subsidy that. So you don't see much affordable housing happening there. So it really becomes, how can you work in partnership with the city, who should have an incentive to have more affordable housing. But if they're not willing to essentially play ball and provide some level of subsidies, it becomes very difficult.
Yeah, the only thing that the private public partnerships are critical for that. I think I do agree with what Chris was saying, is creating an incentive, not just to the developer. We've been focused very much on the developers incentive, creating an incentive for local government to create an opportunity for affordable housing, I think is a big part of that solution. On top of that, there are new systems with respect to technology and construction that are formulating over time, and for the cities to allow them to be implemented within their jurisdiction is also critical, because that has a big impact on costs as well.
So with that, let's take a break for 10 minutes. Give a round of applause to our panel here.